Mist clings to the slopes above Lake Lucerne, and the fir trees are so still you can hear the creak of leather harnesses. Long before you see the riders, in the valley below, men in wool and patched mail plant ashwood shafts into damp earth, shoulder to shoulder, their breath turning to fog. The pikes look like a winter thicket that decided to stand up and march. If you were dropped into this line, with the night thundering at you, you probably wouldn't survive, not because the Swiss are magical, but because everything here is measured. In heartbeat, timing, and mutual trust. The world that forces this posture is feudal Europe, where armored horsemen are the tax collectors of war. The officially recognized hinge in the Swiss story is the 1291 Federal Charter. 3 Alpine communities swearing mutual defense after Habsburg pressure tightened like a vice. That pact doesn't invent a formation overnight, but it creates the social engine for one. When you don't have a king's treasury, you weaponize what you do have: steep terrain, stubborn autonomy, and peasants who drill like their farms depend on it because they do. A pike square is simple physics turned into policy. Men pack in deep ranks, points angled forward and slightly up. The front bristles to stop a charge. The middle shoves, the rear feeds replacements and keeps the mass moving. Its strengths are moral and mechanical. Cavalry hate impaling themselves, and a square that doesn't blink becomes a moving fortress. Its weaknesses are just as real. If the ranks lose alignment, the pikes tangle. If the square is flanked or broken by missiles, it can collapse into a crowd. The soldiers need specific skills: steady footwork on rough ground, the ability to pivot as one body, and a kind of disciplined aggression that resists panic when steel hooves hit the air. A lesser-known side fact: many cantons required men to practice with poles during festivals, blending militia readiness with community ritual. And as academic debate still compares these Alpine infantry to Flemish pikemen and later Macedonian style phalanx revivalists, the Swiss case stands out for one reason: the square isn't just a tactic, it's a civic identity, sharpened into a hedge of points. That civic identity hardens over the 14th century inside the cantons, not in royal armories but on common pastures and parish greens. The Swiss square is born from necessity. The Habsburgs can field knights and mercenaries. The mountain valleys can field neighbors. In the wake of repeated Habsburg incursions, especially after Duke Leopold I's pressure campaigns, in the early 1300s, communities begin formalizing militia obligations. Every able-bodied man is expected to show up with kit, and more importantly, to show up knowing where he fits in the block. The pike itself evolves from farm tool logic. Early spears are shorter, but by mid-century the preferred shafts stretch 2, 4, 5, even 6 meters, Asher fir chosen for flex without snapping. Cantonal ordinances standardize lengths and insist on iron heads, and towns like Zurich and Bern start producing pikes in bulk for allied valleys. The army functions less like a feudal retinue and more like a rotating guild. Captains are elected or appointed locally, and banners represent communes, not lords. That matters inside the square. A man stands beside cousins and debtors. Shame. Is a chain stronger than pay? Training focuses on collective movement. Rows learn to dress their line, keeping shoulders aligned, then to step forward in cadence, so the square doesn't ripple. Front ranks practice leveling pikes low to catch horses in the chest. Second and third ranks angle higher to form a layered porcupine. The rear ranks rehearse pushing with pole butts and keeping pressure constant, the infantry equivalent of a siege engine crew. Strengths here are cohesion and replacement depth. If a front man falls, the file closes instantly. Weaknesses are fatigue and rigidity. A long pike is a blessing in open ground, but a curse in tight woods or when sudden turns are needed. A strange side note from Chronicles: some units carried small whistles or horns tuned to specific calls, because shouted commands vanished in the roar of hooves. Scholars argue whether this communal drill resembles the urban Flemish militias at Courtrai. More than any ancient phalanx yet, unlike Flanders, Swiss discipline is welded to oath culture. By the late 1300s, the square is no longer an improvised hedge. It is a practice machine waiting for its first big test. The first big test comes not as a grand duel on a wide plain, but as a trap sprung in rain and pine shadow. In 1315 at Morgarten, an officially recognized battle, and the Swiss Confederacy's early mythic cornerstone Habsburg Duke Leopold's column squeezes. Along a narrow causeway between lake and slope, the Swiss don't meet them with chivalric courtesy, they meet them with geometry. Men form tight blocks at the choke point, pikes and halberds braced while others roll rocks and logs from above. A knight's charge needs runway and momentum. Here it finds neither. Horses rear, ranks bunch, and the square becomes less a stationary wall than a wedge that shoves down the line, turning armored superiority into traffic. Mechanically, the formation works because its front doesn't fight so much as deny space. A pike square says, there is no gap to ride through. The skills required are brutal in their simplicity. Hold your angle, keep your feet under you on slick ground, and keep stepping forward even when the world feels like it's falling on your head. Strengths show immediately, the dense mass absorbs shock, and every man becomes part of a single weapon. Weaknesses also appear in broken terrain. Pikes catch on brush and each other, and if panic spreads, the whole block can fold. 2 decades later, the Battle of Laupen in 1339 gives a clearer look at Swiss pike doctrine in open field conditions. Facing a coalition of Freiburg and Habsburg-aligned nobles, Bernese-led squares anchor the line, while lighter troops guard flanks. Chroniclers describe the Swiss hedgehog advancing in pulse's step. Brace, shove until enemy cavalry loses. Nerve, when knights dismount to fight on foot. The Swiss depth advantage matters. Rear ranks press the front, keeping contact and momentum. A lesser-known side fact from Laupen accounts: some Swiss fighters wore rough leather gloves to prevent splinters and blistering from long pike shafts during hours of pushing tiny logistics that decide whether a formation holds. Academic debate still asks whether Morgarten's victory was more terrain ambush than tactical revolution. But even skeptics concede that by Laupen the square is a repeatable system, not a lucky hillside. The age of automatic cavalry dominance is officially cracked. Once you've seen a cavalry charge fail twice, you start believing it can fail anywhere. By the 1470s, the Swiss squares are no longer just cantonal militias. They're a feared export, and the Burgundian Wars become their high water mark. The officially recognized set piece here is the Battle of Grandson in 1476, where Charles the Bold's Burgundian army, rich in artillery, heavy horse, and confidence, faces Swiss columns surging out of the hills. What looks like a mob from a distance resolves into disciplined blocks at the moment of contact. Pikes level, banners centered, drums setting the pace so the square moves like a single lung. The Swiss army functions now with a mature internal rhythm. Vanguard squares the Vorhut fix the enemy. Main body squares the Gulthaufen, literally force heap, deliver the shove. A rearguard keeps the column from fraying. Halberdiers and swordsmen nestle inside the pike forest for close work. Once the enemy line buckles, at Grandson, Burgundy's cavalry probes can't find a seam and recoils. The Swiss keep stepping, turning defense into a battering ram. The same year at Merton, the squares cross open ground under fire, then crash into Charles's infantry before his cavalry can redeploy, proof that the formation has learned to advance under pressure, not merely stand. Strengths are at full brightness, depth that soaks shock, morale that feeds on communal oath. Pikes long enough to dictate the fight's distance. Weaknesses are clearer too. The square is hungry for cohesion. If artillery chews lanes through it, or if the flanks are turned, the whole mass becomes vulnerable. Soldiers need not just courage, but a craftsman's timing, knowing exactly when to lower, when to lift, when to sidestep without opening a hole. They also need stamina. A Gulthaufen might march for hours and still have to hit like a hammer. A strange side fact from Burgundian loot lists: Swiss troops captured so many fine Burgundian siege guns and tents at Grandson that some cantonal treasuries ran on this war windfall for years, and an academic debate comparing Swiss pike power to the English longbow system or Italian condottieri cavalry. The Burgundian Wars are the exhibit A for infantry supremacy and Alpine square, turning Europe's richest duke into a cautionary tale. Europe watches Charles the Bold collapse and does what Europe always does after a battlefield lesson. It copies, then tries to solve the copy. Swiss squares become mercenary gold, hired by French kings, Milanese dukes, even the Pope. But imitation isn't the same as origin. The officially recognized turning point for the wider continent is the Italian Wars beginning in 1494, where French armies march into Italy with Swiss pike blocks at their core. In battles like Fornovo 1495 and later Novara 1513, the squares move through vineyards and river flats in great columns. Their advance still that old pulse brace, shove, inhale, exhale while crossbowmen and early handgunners skirmish. Around the edges. Other powers respond by building their own pike systems. The German lanznecks, state-backed and fiercely competitive, adopt similar deep squares but add brighter uniforms, two-handed swordsmen, and a culture of swagger that tries to rival Swiss oath discipline. The Spanish refine the tercio, blending pikes with arquebusiers into a mixed arms block that can answer threats in multiple directions. Functionally, this is the beginning of countermeasure logic. If pikes dominate distance, guns and artillery must dominate disruption. You can see the weaknesses of the pure pike square being hunted. Cannon fire doesn't need to beat the square head-on. It only needs to punch disorder into it. Arquebusiers aim for officers and banner bearers, because a square without a center becomes a herd. Flanking cavalry, lighter and more mobile than the old knightly charge, circles for the moment the pikes are fixed forward. The soldiers inside the square now need new skills, not just holding rank, but holding rank while noise, smoke, and shot tear at their nerve. They also need flexibility, learning to open lanes for friendly firearms, then close them again. A lesser-known side fact from Italian war camp records: Swiss mercenary contracts sometimes specified exact pike lengths and even replacement wood suppliers because mismatched shafts could ruin unit alignment. Academic debate often frames this era as Swiss pikes versus Spanish tercia mass purity against combined arms, and the verdict is that the square remains lethal, but no longer unquestioned. It is entering a world that has learned how to unmake it. By the early 16th century, the Swiss square is both everywhere and already aging. The officially recognized moment that signals its limits is Marignano in 1515. Swiss mercenary columns, confident from decades of success, slam into the French near Milan. At first the pikes bite three huge squares driving forward in dusk and powder smoke. But France fights with a new orchestra: gendarmes who wait for openings, artillery that pounds the blocks, and handgunners whose volleys search out banner bearers and officers. The squares fight for 2 grinding days, repeatedly forcing the French line to recoil, yet each advance costs cohesion. By nightfall, the Swiss are still dangerous, but no longer irresistible. They withdraw with their reputation dented by gunpowder and fatigue, rather than by any single heroic foe. Functionally, the formation's logic still works when it dictates distance. In open ground against infantry that can't match reach or depth, a well-dressed square remains a moving fortress that can attack. Its strengths are unchanged. Long pikes create a no-go zone for horses. Deep ranks replace losses instantly. Synchronized stepping turns many bodies into one weapon. And embedded halberdiers can surge out once the enemy line wobbles. But its weaknesses are now systemic. The denser the block, the more profitable a cannon shot becomes. The more the pikes commit forward, the more their flanks invite envelopment. Soldiers must master a paradoxical skill set: iron steadiness under fire and the ability to pivot, or open lanes for allied shooters without letting the whole mass fray. A strange side fact from this era: Swiss cantons, alarmed by casualties abroad, held public debates on limiting mercenary service and even taxed foreign contracts. Politics shaped by a formation's fame. Academic debate comparing this legacy to Macedonian phalanxes or later Napoleonic columns tends to agree on one point: the square-proved disciplined infantry could set the terms of battle in a cavalry world, but it also exposed the cost of rigidity. When technology shifts, what endures is less the exact shape than the idea: deep, mutually supportive ranks, drill as a weapon, and the belief that infantry trained to move as one can stop anything that moves faster. Conclusion and effectiveness assessment: Swiss pike square worked because it turned community into mechanics. No single pike stops a charging knight, a 100 pikes held by men who trust each other do, in the 14th and 15th centuries. That trust was engineered by oath culture, local command, and constant drilling. The square's effectiveness peaked when 3 conditions lined up: reasonably open terrain, enemies relying on shock cavalry or short-reach foot, and Swiss units that kept alignment and morale intact. Under those conditions, the formation was not merely defensive. It advanced, absorbed impact, and then shoved with the force of its depth, turning stalled charges into collapses. Its battlefield power blended physics and psychology. Horses will not willingly impale themselves on a bristling wall, and riders who feel momentum dying hesitate. The square exploited that hesitation, then used rear-rank pressure to keep the front lethal and moving. Halberdiers and swordsmen nestled inside, acted like a hidden second phase, spilling out to finish once an opponent's line buckled. Yet the same density that made the square unstoppable in close fight made it vulnerable to disruption. Artillery and arquebuses didn't need to beat pikes head-to-head. They only needed to punch disorder into the ranks, kill leaders, and open seams for cavalry or mixed infantry to pry wider. In the long view, most historians rate the Swiss square as a decisive infantry revolution of late medieval Europe, comparable in impact to the English longbow system and later the Spanish tercio in their own eras. It forced every major power to rethink the balance between horse and foot, and it seeded the professional pike armies of the Renaissance. But it was never timeless. Once commanders learned to combine guns, cannon, and mobile cavalry in coordinated layers, the square's single-purpose brilliance became a liability. Its real legacy is the lesson that discipline and formation can rewrite the rules of war right up until the rules change again.